Okay, next up on the Hot Cage podcast, in the flurry, I am joined by the host of my favorite MMA podcast, ProMMA Radio, a man who can and must be followed at Larry Pepe, the incomparable Larry Pepe. Larry, how are you?
I'm doing great, John. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. All right, let's get right into it. On your show, you had an issue with some of the things that have occurred since the bell rang on the Mark Hunt Bigfoot Silva fight, which could very well be the fight of the year. So if I'm following along, there was a fight in Australia, a failed drug test, a Brazilian doctor, and a lot of questions. So fill in the blanks for our audience. What are your issues with the Bigfoot Silva situation?
Oh, God. How much time do we have?
As much as you need.
I think there's a lot of blame pie to go around in this situation, but let me say at the outset that I hope that anybody who has a vote or an opinion about anything does not give this fight of the year, nor do they give Vitor Belfort Fighter of the Year, because I think we cannot continue to just go with the narrative that these guys are on TRT and it's okay because the commissions approve it. As long as we continue to ignore it and then reward it by saying, oh my God, this is Fight of the Year, this is Fighter of the Year, and all this other crap, it's only going to make it easier for it to continue to proliferate. And I think it's one of the real big bad issues in mixed martial arts that the UFC doesn't want to talk about. And let me start with them. They clearly don't want to talk about it because they hid it. They gave a therapeutic use exemptions to Antonio as they were acting as their own commission in Australia. For listeners that may not know or are newer to MMA or this issue, when the UFC goes to a country that does not have an athletic commission, they act as their own athletic commission, and in some cases, like when they went to Canada for UFC 152, when Vitor was given a therapeutic use exemption that they hid as well, although there is a commission there, that commission does not do drug testing. So the UFC handled all the drug testing, TUEs, TRT, and all that business for that card. And the reason I bring that card up and relate it to this card is because in both cases, with the UFC acting as their own commission, they granted therapeutic use exemptions to Vitor and to Bigfoot and hid it from the media. In the case of UFC 152 with Vitor, they said, we gave somebody a therapeutic use exemption. Said fighter did not test out of normal limits, and we're not going to tell you who it is. And only weeks later did they come forth and disclose that it was Vitor. In this case with Bigfoot, Stephen Morocco from MMA Junkie asked Mark Ratner, if you believe Stephen Morocco, if you believe his Twitter, on December 6th, he asked Mark Ratner, who is the VP for Regulatory Affairs for the UFC, who is in essence the de facto commissioner when they act as their own commission in these foreign jurisdictions that don't have their own commission. He asked them point blank, did anybody get a therapeutic use exemption for testosterone? And Ratner, according to Morocco, flat out said no. Now, on the one hand, we want to commend them for failing Bigfoot when he took too much testosterone and his levels were too high, and they suspended him, and that's all appropriate. But this crap of hiding identities of people who are getting these things or denying that anybody is getting it in the first place is ridiculous. And to me, it's indicative that in everyone's heart of hearts, everybody knows that this is wrong. Because if it's not wrong, then why are you hiding it? That's my question.
And it's a valid one. And I guess my question to you is, on the heels of that, do you think that the UFC or all parties involved here, so we'll start with Ratner, and let's just say the buck stops with him before we start to go further up the chain, but let's start with Ratner. Do you think that he's acting negligently or nefariously?
Well, I don't think it's negligent because negligent assumes that there is no intent. If I ask you, John, did you do X? And you say, no, Larry, I didn't, but you did, that's not negligent. Unless you didn't know that you were lying when you lied to me, that's not negligent. Mark Ratner's a very intelligent man. I am sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that he knew when he was asked the question, since it was days before the card, he would have had to have known if they were granting a TUE to Bigfoot or not. So that's number one. Marco Tenore, who is the Brazilian doctor, who is the medical director for the Brazilian Commission, if you will, somehow gets involved in this, even though the fight is taking place in Australia, not Brazil. He is accused by Bigfoot of being the, quote, UFC doctor, and Bigfoot's story is that he goes to his doctor tells him that he needs testosterone, so he contacts Dr. Tenore in Brazil, the quote-unquote UFC doctor, who just happens to be the medical director for the Brazilian Commission, to put him on testosterone, so he blames him. Tenore comes back, and by the way, I've never seen this many press releases regarding a drug test failure in my life. Tenore comes back and says, no, I was never his doctor, but his doctor and I communicated about the fact that he was taking testosterone and his levels weren't coming up enough, so I emailed him as, I guess, a liaison between Bigfoot and his doctor as to what dosing he should take. Well, I got bad news for you, Dr. Tenore. When you start telling somebody what to take, when you start dealing with their dosage regimen of a drug, you're acting as a doctor. Sorry. It's not me doing it. You're a medical professional consulting with somebody and telling them what to take and when to take it. So how does he get involved in this? How? So everybody's got testosterone on their hands. And to me, it's an ugly situation that people aren't paying enough attention to procedurally what went on here. And the thing that really blows my mind is when you read Tenore's statement. He says that Bigfoot tested high for elevated testosterone ratio. Well, if he believes that, then he has no business being the medical director of anything, because once you get a TUE, your testosterone to epitestosterone ratio is irrelevant. Because all a TE ratio tells you, John, is that the athlete is on testosterone. That's all it tells you. It's a urine test that is used to determine, hey, is this your testosterone floating around in your bloodstream, or are you taking synthetic testosterone, and that's why you have this testosterone in your bloodstream? Well, once you get a TUE, you've already admitted that you're on synthetic testosterone. You're allowed to be on synthetic testosterone. So at that point, like the Nate Marquardt situation, which is the situation Bigfoot finds himself in, it's not a question of whether you're using, because the commission, in this case the UFC, is permitting you to use. It's a question of whether you're now taking too much. Well, that can only be determined by one thing, and that's a blood test. And it has nothing to do with TE ratio. It is simply a blood test that tells you how much testosterone is in someone's body, in their bloodstream. So when he says he tested positive for a high ratio, I'm sitting there saying, does he even know anything about this? And he's the medical director of the Brazilian Commission, where, oh, by the way, Vitor keeps getting testosterone exemptions?
Yeah, it's curious, and that's putting it lightly. But I guess for me, and I hate the term devil's advocate, so I'll hesitate to use it. But to play the other side of the coin here, any chance that there's just a sort of a big brother thing at work here, where the UFC just feels like they're withholding certain information to protect the fighters and not make them a party? Because when Vitor had some of his issues, the media was all over him, with good reason. I mean, they were going after him, asking questions and all that. So is there maybe a component to that they're protecting the fighters, or because why not just not tell about the failure? Like, why not? I mean, if they're their own commission, why not just keep everything under wraps? Is it because that maybe they thought, okay, this is something we can't keep under wraps because if people find out about this, it's even worse? How does that what do you think about all that? Is there a chance they're protecting fighters?
I don't doubt that they're protecting fighters. The question is, if TRT is hunky-dory, if there's nothing wrong with it, then what do you have to protect them from? Like, what are you protecting them from? The media? First of all, this MMA media is such a joke most of the time that you wouldn't have to protect them from much. And if you look at it, you bring up Vitor, and Vitor definitely takes a lot of crap for being on testosterone. But does Chael Sonnen? Last time I checked, Chael Sonnen was like, everyone kisses his ass, and he's like the poster boy for the UFC. Does Dan Henderson take an ounce of crap for being on TRT? Nope, not an ounce. Did Ben Rothwell take any crap for it? No. The reason Vitor takes a lot of crap for it is because he looks dramatically different since he's been on it. He's fighting dramatically differently since he's been on it. And every time he opens his mouth about it, he gives people ammunition. That's why he takes so much crap. To be perfectly honest, Bigfoot might have the most legitimate claim to it because he has a condition called acromegalia, which is otherwise known as Frankenstein syndrome. It's like where his skull protrudes and all that type, the bones of his face and things like that. And low testosterone can be linked to acromegalia. So I've seen people say, you know, yeah, it's BS that they hit it and everything else, but he might have the more legitimate claim. Here's what I would say to that, and this is where the Bigfoot blame comes in. Bigfoot tested positive. Oh, yeah, that's a little ugly known fact that people don't want to talk about at all. Tested positive in 2008. So he's in the same boat as Vitor in one regard, that whether you agree with the idea of TRT or not, the idea that a former drug user who has failed a performance-enhancing drug test should then be allowed to supplement legally with performance enhancers when we know that prior PED usage can be a cause of low testosterone is insane. So Bigfoot's in that boat because he failed in 2008. Now, where it gets interesting is his manager came out after he failed and said, Bigfoot, because of his condition, he has to take Novadex to boost his testosterone levels, and he needs this to live, and he pays $6,000 to $8,000 a month for a drug called Novadex. First of all, the idea that anybody would pay $6,000 to $8,000 a month for Novadex, Novadex is an estrogen suppressor. That's all it does. And that's how it boosts testosterone, because by suppressing estrogen, the body then creates more testosterone. It doesn't cost remotely that much money. But let's put that aside for a minute. The drug he failed for in 2008 was a drug called boldenone. Boldenone is also known as equipoise. It's a drug for horses. It is a veterinary drug, and it has zero effect on testosterone levels. So everything his manager said contradicts the drug that he tested positive for. He's a prior tested for a banned substance user. And now, John, somehow, when his testosterone was so bad that he, quoting, chooses life, like it's life or death whether he takes Novadex, somehow since then, you know how many times he's fought without a therapeutic use exemption and no testosterone? 9 times. 9 times. So you're telling me he was so testosterone deficient that he was going to defy the commission and not honor his suspension and go fight out of the country on Novadex, which is a performance-enhancing drug. But somehow he mustered up the energy and the strength to fight 9 times before he sought a therapeutic use exemption and beat Fedor and Alistair Overeem on his deathbed somehow. So when you look at the facts and you peel away the layers of the onion, I hope that anybody who's listening walks away and says, why in a combat sport where people punch and kick each other in the head, why are they, and then by they, I mean the athletic commissions, I mean the UFC when it acts as its own commission, why are they allowing this to proliferate the sport?
Well, and there's the question. So here's the question I'll pose to you then. What makes Bigfoot and Vitor special in our current circumstance? Do you feel that kind of the writing on the wall I'm hearing from you is, do you feel that maybe the UFC is either aware or concerned that other things are being used on top of, the testosterone, and these guys have a history of it, and they're trying to not put them in a spot where they could be subjected to, some issues that maybe they're taking some other kind of enhancer?
Yeah, no, I don't even think they're taking other kinds of enhancers. But what we know is that they did in the past. And in most other sports, under a lot of the regulatory rules, you are disqualified from even asking or applying for a therapeutic use exemption if you have ever failed a drug test. Because the idea that I can take something today that is a performance enhancer, fail a drug test for it, and then come back later on, possibly because I caused my own deficiency by illegally using a performance-enhancing drug, and then say, hey, John, guess what? I need this drug legally now, even though I failed a drug test several years ago. That might be the reason that I need the drug now. It's insane. I mean, think of the logic. You can potentially create your own deficiency by failing a drug test and then come back years later and say, yeah, now I need it, and you have to put your stamp of approval. You have to put your get-out-of-jail-free card on it. It's insane.
Yeah, and I think another issue...
It's insane.
Yeah, I think another issue, too, I guess, that sort of is the elephant in the room is, Dana White kind of doesn't do himself any favors, that he's such a sharp, savvy guy that on the one hand, he's telling you how much he really despises testosterone use and all that, but then on the other hand, he's not really getting involved in sort of, there's a lot of hanging chads, if you will, out there that could be solidified one way or the other, and we know that he's a guy who's certainly capable enough to solidify them, and it's not being done. So does that concern you on any level? Does it make you feel like maybe there's, I don't know, something going on?
Well, it's not as much that it concerns me. It's just that I recognize that it's a bunch of PR crap, right? I mean, Dana thought testosterone replacement was okay, if you remember, then came out and said, we're going to test the blank out of you guys. I'm coming for you guys because I don't like, that they can gain an advantage in training, and we're going to test them like crazy. You remember that? There was a post-fight scrum or a pre-fight scrum that he did with the media, and he went on and on about how I'm coming for you guys and blah, 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 blah. And then now it's, hey, Vitor should, Vitor's doing everything by the book, and there's no reason, that Vitor shouldn't be able to, move forward, get a title shot and everything else and blah, blah, blah. My concern is this. At the end of the day, Dana's a promoter. The UFC is a promotion. And I think there is an inherent conflict of interest when they act as their own commission because, they want their fighters to perform at the highest level. And when you sanction testosterone usage, I know that sometimes when people hear the word testosterone, they're like, oh, yeah, testosterone. Like they see all the low-T commercials. It is a drug. It is an anabolic steroid. It is a performance-enhancing drug. When given to young athletes, and let me suggest to you, John, that when you look at the percentage of athletes in the UFC who are getting or who have sought therapeutic use exemptions for testosterone, the comparison to the normal percentage of males who seek testosterone usage is high. But when you really compare it to healthy 30-something-year-old professional athletes in a combat sport that requires strength, that requires conditioning, all the things that people with low testosterone would have less of, the ratio is ridiculous. So either Mixed martial arts attracts the most screwed up genetic in terms of testosterone athletes in the world, or the system is being gamed, or there is something about mixed martial arts inherently, whether it's weight cutting, whether it's getting punched in the head and your pituitary not secreting enough testosterone anymore, that causes these deficiencies. And I would suggest to you that it's not that we attract the worst testosterone genetic athletes in the world. It could be the latter, but I don't have any question in my mind that the system is being gamed, and at the end of the day, I just think when you have a combat sport, look, man, this ain't baseball. It's not about, gee, you know, the baseball went 50 more feet, so he got 20 more home runs than he would have. We can argue about that all day long. But nobody's getting hurt by that physically. When you're in a combat sport, the idea that we're sanctioning drug use, we're sanctioning performance-enhancing drug use because somebody's deficient. Well, then maybe they shouldn't be fighting.
Yeah.
Maybe it's time to do something else.
True.
But the idea that the person standing across the cage from them now has to contend with a synthetically altered athlete, and that athletic commissions and the very promotion that employs them is putting a stamp on it, is mind-blowing to me. And I think there will come a point where a 60-Minute Sports or one of these news programs is going to get a hold of this story, and MMA is going to look ridiculous.
Yeah, they need to get it. They certainly need to get out in front of it. Obviously, as with most things, transparency is probably the best way to go here, and maybe getting a third party involved when they don't have sanctioning bodies. Even if it was a Mark Ratner type who just operated, sort of autonomous of the UFC, you'd feel a little bit better, that this guy kind of answers to someone other than, his promotion. So my last question.
But John, I'll go one. Let me go one more step with you on that, and then I'll go wherever you want to go. Dana sometimes says, hey, we're tested by the government, blah, blah, blah. That's the standard line. And then he'll say, hey, if they get a license, if the Nevada Commission says it's okay, if the Pennsylvania Commission says they're okay, they're okay. Well, you don't have to say they're okay. You don't have to give them a fight. Like, there is nothing stopping the UFC from ending this issue tomorrow. Tomorrow. The UFC is an independent, private business. They can do whatever the hell they want. That's completely up to them. Now, I could go to, not me, but let me use me as an example. I could go in front of the commission, get my, testosterone okayed, and get my license. Does that mean the UFC has to give me a fight? No. UFC decides who they put in the cage against who. They decide what contracts they write. They decide who they sign, who they drop. It's completely 100% up to them. So don't fall for the argument that, well, they got a license, so who am I? Who are you? You're the promoter. You're the one cutting that guy's paycheck. You're his boss. So if the UFC wanted to, they could end the testosterone controversy today. All they'd have to do is say, you know what? Regardless of whether the commission is comfortable with this, I'm not comfortable with it. So if you're on testosterone, we're just not going to give you a fight. We're just not going to give you a fight. And the best evidence that this issue is a joke are the fighters who said they would die without it, who then chose not to use it anymore, or who said they couldn't function without it. Nate Marquardt, Shane Roller, Antonio Bigfoot Silva, for 9 fights after he tested positive. He never sought a therapeutic use exemption, but his manager says he was testosterone deficient back in 2008. Not only did he fight without it, he beat Fedor and Overeem. He had the best fights of his career on nothing. So if you recognize the hypocrisy of it and you're the UFC, you can put an end to it tomorrow. You have the power to do that.
Well, yeah, and also, as you said, it's not as if they're not, they're not knowledgeable enough to do it because they function as their own, commission when abroad. So they certainly would know, is this a situation that we would be comfortable with? Were we commissioning or were we sanctioning this fight? Yes, I know it's in Las Vegas. Yes, I know it's in California. I know they have athletic commissions. But if it wasn't there, would we be comfortable with the situation? And if not, then you're right. I mean, I think they sort of have to act on in a way. So, okay, here's my final question. It's a little bit, I don't want to say, it's certainly not as big as the other things we've talked about. But Dana White said today the fight between Mark Hunt and Bigfoot Silva has lost something for him. It's kind of ruined it for him when he found out that Silva tested positive. Does it diminish the fight for you?
Sure it does. Sure it does. Because think about it. I mean, now, again, and I don't have any sympathy, for Dana because, Dana didn't have. First of all, it should have come as no surprise that Bigfoot was on testosterone because they're the ones who approved it. The fact that he took too much, okay, but you let him in the door. Again, you who had the power not to. You who has the power not to. But I think it has to, and this is why I argue that we should not give anyone who's on TRT any of these kind of awards, if you will. Not that, they don't get any money. I mean, it's just like a pride thing. But how can it not take something away from the fight? Because when you really take a step back, John, do we know that Bigfoot would have been able to go 5 rounds with Mark Hunt if he wasn't on testosterone? Do we know that, some of the shots that he hurt Hunt with, maybe Hunt would have absorbed easier and had a better fight if he wasn't on testosterone? And it's the same thing we go through with Vitor. Yes, Vitor looks fantastic. Yes, he, that spinning heel kick that he landed on Luke Rockhold, that's about technique. It's not about testosterone. Sure it is. But you know what? When you hit 20 or 30% harder, it matters. It matters a lot. So do we know that he would have had the same kind of spectacular finishes if he, I don't know. Who can possibly say, yes, we know for sure that whether Vitor was on testosterone or not, when he lands that kick on Rockhold, that's going to be the end of the fight. When he lands that kick on Dan Henderson that flattens him, Dan Henderson who had a legendary chin, that's going to be the end of the fight. Maybe. We could even say probably. But anybody who says they know is full of crap because we can never know, because we can never truly measure how much a drug enhances a particular athlete at a particular time. So now when we look at the Hunt fight, we have to go, I don't know, would Bigfoot have been able to hang in there? Would he have had the same endurance? Would he have had the same strength? Would he have hurt Hunt as much? Would he have slowed Hunt down as much? Would he have had the cardiovascular endurance? How much did it help him in training? These are all the questions that an intelligent person now has to ask themselves. And how is that good?
It's true.
I mean, he failed, right? But Vitor hasn't failed, and we have to ask all the same questions with him. Don't we?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that...
And that's the problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, it certainly it makes Mark Hunt look like an animal, that's for certain. I mean, he kind of... I think that he should be elevated in our minds a little bit, and... But and then the business of them having different results for the same fight with 2 different guys, that right. That becomes weird as well. So all right, last thing.
And then here's one crazy thing, and I know you got to move on, so I'll finish with this. You look at Mark Hunt's reaction when Steven Morocco called him, and granted, you can agree, disagree that Morocco should have told Hunt it was off the record, or did he need to? I don't even care because it's such a nothing issue in this huge issue. Well, what was the first thing he said? Damn, how are these guys getting all this stuff? I got to get on some of this stuff myself. Now, he could have been joking.
Right.
But if you've ever been around professional athletes, and I have had the good fortune of being around a good amount of them in both the bodybuilding community and the fight community. They don't become professional athletes because they're not ultra, ultra, ultra competitive. And when you're an athlete, especially competing in a sport where people punch you in the face, and you start to get the feeling, anecdotally, like, gee, there's a lot of guys getting approved for this stuff. How many guys who aren't getting approved are using it? And there's big money on the line for these guys who are fighting in the upper echelon of the sport. So now all of a sudden, that mentality of, hey, well, these guys are all getting this stuff, I got to get some of this stuff. And that's where it starts to become a snowball rolling down a hill. Because if you start to believe as an athlete, rightly or wrongly, that most of the people you compete with are juiced, guess what a lot of athletes are going to do?
They're going to juice.
Bingo.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, last thing I need from you. Dana says it's going to be, if not the biggest fight in UFC history, the biggest fight of the year. How do you see Saturday's main event playing out? Weidman Silva 2.
You know, I picked Weidman to beat Silva at UFC 162, and I was very confident. I'm picking him again, but I'm less confident for this reason. Not because Silva did what he did, because if you watch Anderson Silva fight, he does it in almost every fight. And it's part of what makes him who he is. And what a lot of people kind of miss is that when he fights with that hands-down style, part of that is because it makes it easier for him to stop takedowns, which is his real glaring weakness in his game if you look at the Chael Sonnen fight. So I don't expect him to come in there with his hands up in some kind of conventional style all of a sudden. Far from it. The reason I was very confident the first time is because I think Chris Weidman is a much better wrestler than Chael Sonnen. And I saw what Chael was able to do to Anderson for 6 rounds in terms of putting him on his back. And I felt like Weidman would go in, grind him, submit him, or just grind him and get at least 3 out of the 5 rounds and win the fight. My only concern coming into this fight is if you knocked Anderson Silva out, I hope that that doesn't make you think now that you can successfully stand with him. Because I think if Chris stands with Anderson, you know, for 10 rounds, he loses 9 of them. And it just so happened that he got that knockout, and it wasn't lucky, not suggesting that, but I still think Anderson Silva is a superior striker to Chris Weidman. And I hope, for Weidman's sake, that he hasn't convinced himself otherwise. If he hasn't, and he goes in with a wrestling-centric, submission-centric style, I think he beats Anderson Silva the way I thought he would beat him the first time. I certainly didn't see a knockout coming, and I don't see one coming now. But I think if he sticks to that type of game plan, I still have no evidence that Anderson can really stop Weidman's takedowns. And if he can't, he's going to end up on his back for the better part of 5 rounds or get submitted, because the big difference between Chael and Weidman is that Weidman is a submission wizard. And it's a part of his game that a lot of people forget about. But this was a guy who was training for 9 or 10 months in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and went and fought in the Abu Dhabi World Championships, which is like our Olympics of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and fared very well and lost to the overall champion that year. So he's hell on the ground, and I think if